Hi, and welcome to our lecture on the heart. Here we see the heart sitting deep to the sternum, about 2/3 to the left of the midline, 1/3 to the right, and laying slightly on its right ventricle. So we're going to learn a little bit about the heart in this chapter, including some circuits, some vessels, chambers, and valves. We're going to begin here with kind of the most significant topics of the chapter, the two circuits that the heart pumps. And we kind of want to begin with this idea that, of course, we have to pump to our lungs and we have to pump to our body, and that the efficient way to do the different tasks that we have for those different circuits is to have them be separate, with one feeding into the other. So we're going to begin here with a circuit that carries carbon dioxide-rich blood, that would be oxygen-poor blood, from the heart to the gas-exchanging surfaces of the lungs. This is the pulmonary circuit. So we can see that beginning here in the right ventricle. It's going to pump out and go to either lung, engage in gas exchange within the capillaries of the lung, and return back towards the left side of the heart here. Now, some of the things I want to introduce as we're taking a look at this: when we see blue on here, that's indicating that that blood is low in oxygen. Generally, that means it's high in carbon dioxide. The red is going to indicate that the blood is high in oxygen. And the purple is going to indicate that we are in a transition between those two. So again, to think about the pulmonary circuit, we begin with this low oxygen blood. It's blood that's already been to the body. We pump it out towards our lungs. It picks up oxygen in those gas-exchanging surfaces where capillaries lay on top of the alveoli or air sacs of the lung, and then we return this high oxygen blood to the left side of the heart. Now that'll actually take us to our next circuit, the systemic circuit. The systemic circuit is going to carry oxygen-rich blood, blood that should be low in carbon dioxide, to the body's tissues. Obviously, when it gets to the body's tissues, it's going to pick up CO2 and deliver that oxygen, and then return back to the heart. So this systemic circuit is going to begin here in the left ventricle. It's going to pump out through a large vessel called the aorta, and you can see we're showing red high oxygen blood here. It's going to go either to the head or to the body, and we're going to eventually get to some place in the tissues where we exchange. We deliver that oxygen that is being utilized by the cells and pick up the CO2 they've been producing, and we return that up here to the right side of the heart. So those are our two circuits: pulmonary circuit going to the lungs to pick up oxygen, the systemic circuit traveling everywhere else in the body to deliver the oxygen. So let's talk again about that location of the heart. The heart sits in the mediastinum. The mediastinum, of course, is a part of the thoracic cavity. It's the space in between the lungs. It contains the heart and some other things. Some of these vessels that we see here, the esophagus, which carries food from our throat down to our stomach, and depending on which portion we're in, we may have the trachea. Of course, it's only going to go a certain distance down before bifurcating to serve either of the lungs. We do recognize that the heart is about 2/3 to the left of the midline. So if we take a look at this picture, we can go midline right down through the sternum here. Off to the right side of our screen is going to be the left side of the heart. You can see a little bit more of that is sticking out here to the left side of the sternum, still protected by the costal cartilages. And then we have a little bit of it over here to the right side. What's interesting maybe about the right side is that we have the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava relatively straight up and down as they enter the right atrium, and that's because the heart is laying on its right ventricle. We can see the left ventricle over here on the other side of this interventricular artery, which kind of is a nice dividing line for us visually. Of course, the heart, again, resting on the diaphragm on its right ventricle. Hardest chamber to see from here is actually the left atrium, which is largely on the posterior side of the heart, given how it sits within the chest. So here we can see an actual heart, and hey, this is kind of a mess, right? So we see some ventricles here. This is the right ventricle laying on the diaphragm. We've got this anterior interventricular artery. You can barely see that left ventricle over here. There's actually a little indentation in that left lung to make room for some of that heart. This vessel here is leaving the right ventricle. It's the pulmonary trunk. It comes up just to about here, and then splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries, which serve either lung. You can see this lung here being retracted or pulled back. We have here the ascending aorta. It's going to actually come up and then curve over in an arch, giving rise to vessels here, here, and here, which serve the head and the arms. These things that look more like little bags rather than these thick kind of muscular tubes, these are the superior vena cava, or down below here we would have the inferior vena cava coming up into the right atrium. And even most of the atrium itself, although a chamber of the heart, is going to be thinner and more bag-like, with the ventricles being much more muscular chambers. So when we do think about the heart, we want to remember the membranes it's associated with and the fact that it sits within what we refer to as a pericardial sac. So the pericardial sac is going to be this tough fibrous wrapper. Now it's going to have, of course, this kind of thinner serous membrane lining it, and we can actually take a look at that up here if we get kind of in really close. We have this fibrous pericardium on the outside, and then there's both a parietal layer and a visceral layer of the serous pericardium. That would be the serous membranes we learned about earlier, and we simply referred to them at that time as the parietal pericardium and visceral pericardium. Things are going to get a little bit more complicated here, but we're going to build on that. When we think about the heart, in addition to having the sac on the outside, which is the fibrous part of the pericardium, or what we call the pericardial sac, we have three layers. And on the outside, we have the epicardium. This is actually the visceral pericardium we talked about earlier in the semester. And we can kind of take a look at that by seeing this parietal pericardium here. And again, we've got this serous layer of this parietal pericardium, which is a simple squamous epithelium. There's a space, the pericardial cavity, which is going to have a little bit of serous fluid in it. And then we're going to have this epicardium. It's going to be that visceral pericardium, that simple squamous epithelium layer, and a little bit of areolar connective tissue associated with it. So that's going to be our epicardium, epi meaning on the outside or kind of upon. The myocardium then is this thickest layer. It's the muscular layer of the heart, and of course that's formed by cardiac muscle. We can actually tell that because we can see the intercalated discs, which are key characteristics of the cardiac muscle, as well as the fact that they have a single central nucleus and these branched fibers. Then we have an inner layer. This inner layer is actually a lot like the outer layer. We have a simple squamous epithelium and some areolar connective tissue. This is called the endocardium. You can see that this layer that is composing it, which is the epithelial layer, is referred to as the endothelium. And this is the term we're going to use as we have this same lining of the inside of the heart become the inside lining of vessels. So we would talk about the endothelium of a vessel, but the endocardium is then the combination of that endothelium and the areolar connective tissue, which helps bind it to that myocardium. Now, I did just mention intercalated discs. Of course, cardiac muscle cells are connected by these specialized junctions, and we do have desmosomes which tie them together, gap junctions which allow for the flow of ions, and so these intercalated discs are important in allowing the spread of the electrical kind of stimulation of the heart muscle. Now, when you get into physiology class, you're going to learn about the heart's intrinsic conduction system, where we're going to have the beginning of contractions with this SA node here. This SA node is going to cause atrial contractions. There's going to be a little bit of delay as we get into this AV node before spreading through what we call Purkinje fibers into the ventricle to make sure that the ventricles contract. And what this sets up for us is that the heart itself is its own pacemaker. Starts with the SA node, contracts the atria, gives a pause, allows the ventricles then to contract to eject blood from the heart, and then it's going to again have a little bit of a pause. The atria will contract to fill the ventricles, and again, like I said, you'll learn more about this in physiology class. If someone has a pacemaker, it's probably because maybe this isn't working right, or perhaps this isn't working right down here. So our heart is also held together. It's not just muscle, it also has some valves, and it has what's referred to as a fibrous skeleton, which is going to be some of the connective tissue which helps to stabilize that musculature, and we can see that particularly pronounced here around the valves. It's almost like this is the diaphragm muscle and this is the central tendon. And these are going to surround these valves here and kind of help stabilize this area. If you're wondering what this particular view is, the atria have been removed and we're able to look down upon the valves, which are going to be, in this case, two semilunar valves, which are between the ventricles and the blood vessels that pump out of them. And then these ones here, the tricuspid and bicuspid, are between the atria and the ventricles. So we do want to take a look also at the sulci of the heart. A sulcus, of course, is some kind of depression, and we've seen these in the cerebral cortex along with the gyri there. And the sulci in the heart are important because these are the locations where our large vessels run. So in this case, we can see an atrium right here and a ventricle down here. Of course, those are on the right side, and I can see the pulmonary trunk exiting the right ventricle here. This is the right coronary artery running through the coronary sulcus. Now there's also coronary sulcus over here on this left-hand side, and the circumflex artery would run through that. Anteriorly between the two ventricles is an anterior interventricular sulcus, and this is the anterior interventricular artery running through that sulcus. It's kind of like having a cleft chin. There's just a little bit of a gap in between that left ventricle and that right ventricle. We, of course, also have one on the backside. The backside can actually be quite confusing, and not every patient will present the backside of their heart in exactly the same way. So we do have a posterior interventricular sulcus, and that would be right here by this posterior interventricular artery. But you can see that there's another large artery coming down in here, and it seems like the arteries are roughly meeting back in here. Again, that presentation will vary from heart to heart, so the back of the heart can be a little bit tougher to look at than the front of the heart. There just seems to be more variation in there. Now back to this idea of circuits. When we take a look at our chambers, we're going to understand why we have these two circuits. And we're going to begin with this idea that it's mammals and birds that have four-chambered hearts. Now both of these groups evolved from organisms that didn't have four-chambered hearts, and we kind of can think to the evolution of the heart from simple pumping vessels in organisms like worms to in fish, where we have two chambers, kind of a receiving chamber and then a pumping chamber. It gets a little bit more complicated in the tetrapods, the animals that left the water. The amphibians have a three-chambered heart where they have two atria and a single ventricle, but that allows for mixing of blood that's high in oxygen with blood that is low in oxygen. It's not going to be efficient for having a very high metabolism. Reptiles start to form what's called an interventricular septum, but it tends to be rather incomplete. So the interventricular septum is what divides the two ventricles from each other and allows us to go from a three-chambered heart to a four-chambered heart. Of course, an interatrial septum, and we can see part of the wall of an interatrial septum here, you'd sort of have to put a finger here and a finger in this atrium and pinch to actually feel that interatrial septum, but that's what evolved within amphibians to allow them to have two separate atria. And of course, by having these septa creating separate chambers, we can then have our separate circuits, with the right ventricle being the beginning of that pulmonary circuit, returning blood to the left atrium, pumping down into this left ventricle. We actually pump through this valve into this chamber here in the systemic circuit. It goes out to the body and then returns to the left atrium. So each circuit starts in a ventricle and ends in an atrium on the opposite side. So we do have valves in here, of course, and we can see four of them. We have the tricuspid valve, the bicuspid valve, the pulmonary semilunar, and the one we can't see back under here is the aortic semilunar. Well, the function of these valves is all the same. It's to prevent the backflow of blood, to make sure blood flows in a single direction. And if we think about how this works, even the simplest hearts, even something like an earthworm, would have to have some capacity for valves so that when there is a squeeze on the vessel, the blood goes in one direction, not in both directions, as if you were to grab something like a garden hose and give that a squeeze. So in this kind of case, we've got the right atrium here, and we're going to travel through this valve this direction into the right ventricle. Again, that's the tricuspid valve or the right atrioventricular valve. And when this ventricle gets ready to contract, this valve needs to close so that the blood can't flow back up into the atrium. Instead, the blood will flow up through this valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve, into this pulmonary trunk on its way to the lungs. Now, when the ventricle here relaxes, that will create suction, which would want to suck the blood from the pulmonary trunk back into the ventricle, and we don't want that to happen. So when the ventricle relaxes, that's when this semilunar valve needs to close. All right, so let's take a look at the chambers really quick. The chambers that receive blood from the body or the lungs are the atria, the right atrium, receiving blood from the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava primarily, but also the coronary sinus, and the left atrium receiving blood from 4 pulmonary veins that are coming back from the lungs. We're going to take a look at these vessels, and again, these are part of what we want to know. We'll be learning these in lab as well. So the vessels that drain into the right atrium, that is the end of the line for the systemic circuit, would be the superior vena cava, where vena cava means hollow vein. This is just a kind of a big, gigantic, but thin-walled hose. The inferior vena cava coming from down below, and we actually see very little inferior vena cava in the thoracic cavity because it's coming up through a hole in the diaphragm, and of course the diaphragm is going right across here because the right ventricle lays on that diaphragm. And then this is the opening of the coronary sinus. We'd actually see this on the back side of the heart, and it's the end of the line for all the blood flow that has actually fed the muscle of the heart. So all of that blood, now low in oxygen, returns to this right atrium so that it can be pumped to the right ventricle and then pumped out to the lungs to pick up oxygen. As far as the left atrium goes, much more simple. There are 4 pulmonary veins, and they are returning from the lungs, as you can see here in red, indicating that the blood they carry is high in oxygen because it's just picked up that oxygen in the lungs, and it's returning it right here to this left atrium so that it can be pumped to the left ventricle and then pumped out through the systemic circuit. So one thing I want to cover really quickly here before we go on, although it is part of the vessels chapter, is the idea that arteries are vessels that leave the heart, veins are vessels that return to the heart, arteries tend to have thick muscular walls, veins are thinner. We do not indicate veins in blue and arteries in red. Blue and red indicate oxygen concentration. Now, in the systemic circuit, that means all of the arteries will be red and the veins will be blue. But the pulmonary circuit and fetal circulation are going to be different. So the pulmonary circuit has the opposite coloration of the systemic circuit. In the pulmonary circuit, the arteries, which we see as the pulmonary trunk, and the left and right pulmonary arteries, those are all in blue, and the pulmonary veins will be shown in red. All right, so let's take a look at these valves. We're going to begin with the left atrioventricular valve. The left atrioventricular valve has 2 other names. This is also the bicuspid valve because it has 2 flaps, and the mitral valve because if held upside down, it looks a little bit like a mitre. That's kind of a classic bishop or pope's hat. And this atrioventricular valve here is kind of like this one on the right-hand side. They have different numbers of flaps. So they do have different names. When we call them atrioventricular valves, we use the side of the heart as part of their name, but they do have some things in common. So this tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular, you can see also separates an atrium from a ventricle, and both of these appear to have some strings attached to these little projections of muscle from the bottom of the heart. So we want to know what those things are as well. The strings are referred to as cordi tendini. So that really just means tendinous cords, and they are going to allow what we call papillary muscles, which we see down below, papillary because they are nipple-like projections, to basically be able to tug on the valve. And it's really important to think about what these valves have to endure. They have to open up pretty wide to allow the blood from the atrium to move into the ventricle as the ventricle relaxes and the atrium contracts. That will help to fill the ventricle. But the ventricles are the muscular chambers. They're the ones that when they contract are going to produce a great deal of force, and they are going to push the blood out in this case into the pulmonary trunk, or in the case of the left ventricle, which you can see is even more muscular because it has to pump the systemic circuit, meaning to the entire body, not just to the lungs, it's going to pump out through the aorta. That's going to be a lot of potential pressure, and that pressure is going to be felt by the atrioventricular valve on each side. So the valve is going to be pushed into a closed position, flat across here. But the pressure could potentially push the valve backwards in here like an umbrella in a strong wind. The contraction of the papillary muscles pulling on the chordae tendineae gives resistance to that valve, allowing it to seat in the closed position but not to be blown open in the opposite direction. And we can see what this actually looks like inside the heart here. So here's the papillary muscle. You can see it's not quite maybe as nipple-like as it is in the other pictures. Still might be representative of, say, the udder of a cow. And we see the chordae tendineae here attached to the flap-like portion of the valve up above. Now, of course, our other two chambers are ventricles, and we've been talking about them already. So we talked about ventricles as chambers inside the brain. We're using that same term for chambers down here. These are the muscular pumping chambers. These are the ones that power the circuits. So we can see that we've got our right ventricle over here, pointing at it with a blue arrow because it's going to be low oxygen blood in there. And our left ventricle over here, of course, is part of our systemic circuit, the beginning of the systemic circuit. It has received blood high in oxygen from the left atrium, which had received that coming back from the lungs. The vessel that carries blood from the left ventricle in the systemic circuit is the aorta, and we travel through the aortic semilunar valve, which is located way up here. I've used a dashed line here because we can't actually see that portion of the aorta, and the reason why is that it is deep to the pulmonary trunk, which is here. So the pulmonary trunk is superficial. That's why this aortic semilunar valve is kind of hidden down in here, and it's going to allow blood to be pushed from the left ventricle through this aortic semilunar valve, running up this aorta, which is divided into an ascending aorta, which comes up, and then, I'm going to go back for just a second, an aortic arch, which curves around here and gives rise to 3 vessels, and then becomes the descending thoracic aorta, which works its way behind the heart, before eventually going through the diaphragm down here and becoming the descending abdominal aorta, which runs along the vertebral bodies of the lumbar vertebrae. So the aorta is kind of complex, but the cool thing is we do have a simple single large vessel coming out of here, which will provide blood to the entire body. Of course, on the right side, the big vessel coming out is the pulmonary trunk. This gives me a chance to explain what a trunk is. A trunk is a short artery, and it tends to branch into other major arteries rather than directly supplying blood to a particular organ. So in this case, the pulmonary trunk is going to receive blood from the right ventricle. It's going to travel through this pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And those, of course, continue to split as they produce smaller and smaller arteries to provide this blood to different of those kind of respiratory exchange surfaces of the lung. What we want to take a look at now are things you're probably already familiar with. Maybe you've had your blood pressure taken and you've received some number. 120/80 is kind of a common number to give. For many young students, of course, that might be a little bit high, and we would expect some of those numbers to be a little bit lower. For older people, we might expect some of those numbers to be a little bit higher, particularly if they had high blood pressure. But that higher number is the systole number, or the systolic blood pressure. And the lower number is the diastolic blood pressure. And what those relate to are the fact that we have ventricular contractions, and blood pressure will be higher during ventricular contraction as blood is ejected from the heart, and we feel that as a pulse in our arteries. So this is systole, or that systolic pressure. And then diastole will be the relaxation of those ventricles where we don't have as high of a pressure going through our arteries. So we want to know what's going on with our valves during ventricular systole and during ventricular diastole. So in the case of ventricular systole, the ventricles contract at the same time, They eject blood through the large arteries, the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, and the semilunar valves, which are the pulmonary semilunar and the aortic semilunar, have to be open at this time. Of course, those atrioventricular valves have to be closed, otherwise that ventricular contraction would force the blood back into the atrium. So systole is relatively simple. We just want to think about that as being a contraction. Blood goes out through the vessels. It's going to be these semilunar valves that are open. And we can actually see this quite nicely if we have those atria removed and we are looking down from above. We have closed tricuspid and bicuspid valves, allowing us to see that we have 1, 2, 3 cusps and 2 cusps in the bicuspid or left atrioventricular or mitral valve. And we can see that our semilunar valves are both open. You can probably also see from here that the semilunar valves also have 3 cusps. These two are definitely constructed exactly the same as each other, and the 2 atrioventricular valves are very similar in construction to each other. Diastole, of course, is the relaxation of the ventricles. That means the filling of the ventricles, meaning we have to have an opening between the atrium and the ventricle, so the atrioventricular valves are both open, and the atria will contract to assist along with that suction from the relaxation of the ventricle in the filling of the ventricles. Of course, that means those semilunar valves need to be closed because we don't want to suck that blood from those vessels back into the ventricle. Instead, what we actually want to do is to have some of the kind of contraction of the vessels themselves. It ends up that these vessels near the heart are somewhat elastic. During systole, those vessels will stretch a little bit, and during diastole, those vessels will kind of collapse back down, and that will help to continue the movement of the blood away from the heart. So we can see this from above. We see the open atrioventricular valves, and we have nice views of these closed semilunar valves. You can see that each of these valves is almost like a little cup, and that's very much what we would see in a real heart. Our next topic is going to be blood flow to the heart itself. It starts out really simple because coming off of what we call the ascending aorta, just barely above the aortic semilunar valve, or the holes are actually kind of even almost right next to that aortic semilunar valve, are the right and left coronary arteries. Obviously the right is on the right-hand side and the left is on the left-hand side. Now the tricky thing about this is that the right will go all the way around the back side. The left is very short. It goes deep to the pulmonary trunk and a little bit of that left atrium, what we call the auricle of it, looks like a little ear flap. And then either emerging from there or not even emerging from underneath the atrium, it will split into its 2 main branches. So the left is very short, the right is very long. We want to take a look here at the 2 main branches of the left coronary artery. We have the circumflex artery, which will circle around the back side. So that kind of is the portion of the left coronary artery, which is going to mimic that right coronary artery. And coming down the front of the heart, in the anterior interventricular sulcus, is the anterior interventricular artery, separating the left ventricle from the right ventricle, but providing blood to both of them. On the right-hand side, we have 2 major branches as well. They may not be quite as big as what we have on the left. As we come down that right coronary artery, we give rise on the edge of the right ventricle, that area that's going to be adjacent to the diaphragm, the right marginal artery. Now, I do want to point out there's actually a left marginal artery as well, which is a branch of the circumflex. The reason why we weren't learning that is because we're only learning the 2 major ones from each one. We're not trying to learn any branches of the branches. The posterior interventricular artery, indicated here by this dashed line, is on the back of the heart, and it runs through that posterior interventricular sulcus. Now it ends up that on the back side of the heart, we sometimes have what we refer to as an anastomosis. So this is an interconnection between arteries that can allow collateral circulation, where blood from one artery can flow into the area that's provided by the other one. This is particularly important should there be some kind of blockage. It ends up that you don't want to rely on this in your heart. For the most part, people have relatively small vessels forming anastomoses on the back of their heart, and relatively few people have a significant anastomosis there, such that if they were to have a blockage on one side, they would actually get really good collateral circulation. But we do have these in several other places in our body. We have arches that form in our foot and in our hands, which we could refer to as anastomoses. We have some really important ones in the brain, forming a structure called the circle of Willis, or the cerebral arterial circle. And in that case, we have vessels coming up here. This would be the basilar artery. These would be the internal carotid arteries. And we have a connection between this posterior blood flow and this anterior blood flow called the posterior communicating artery on either side. And towards the front, we give rise to anterior cerebral arteries, which go up in between the two hemispheres on either side. There's a little nub in there called the anterior communicating artery, which connects those two anterior cerebral, such that if you had a blockage right in here, you could have blood actually flow across that anterior communicating and still serve that front part of your frontal lobe. In this case, that would be the right side of the frontal lobe, because we're looking at the brain from the bottom here. Another example of an anastomosis is within areas like, say, our digestive system. We have potentials for these capillary beds, and we can control how much blood goes through the capillaries. We can maybe shut some of that off and allow it to go through this thoroughfare channel here. But we may also have some direct anastomoses between the arterial system and the venous system here, which allow for blood to easily kind of bypass from that arterial flow to the venous flow if we are trying to shut down our capillary beds. Now you can remember that we might shut down some of our digestive blood flow were we to have a fight or flight or sympathetic response, so that we could actually be sending that blood instead primarily to our muscles and to our brain. All right, next we're going to take a look at the venous drainage from the heart. Now this is also going to be relatively simple, but we are going to diagram this out as well in the next chapter. So there are three main veins that drain into the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus, of course, we can see the opening of right back in here, and that is one of the three vessels that drains into that right atrium, along with the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So here, from the front view of the heart, we're going to see the great cardiac vein. This drains the entire left-hand side. It begins alongside the anterior interventricular artery, but then it follows the pathway of the circumflex artery around the back. We then have on this posterior side, which we can see with this dashed line here, this is the middle cardiac vein. The middle cardiac vein is occasionally called the posterior interventricular vein because it does parallel and drain the area provided with blood by the posterior interventricular artery. There is also a small cardiac vein which picks up blood from this right ventricle, starting really along here, and it's going to have some tributaries coming down from here, but it starts along that right marginal and it circles around the back. It is the smallest diameter of all of these cardiac veins. If we were to actually look at this from the back side, we would see a small, we'd see a pretty large great, and we would see the middle in the middle. They, of course, do all drain into that coronary sinus and then back into that right atrium. Our next topic is going to be to take a look at the fetal modifications that are associated with the different conditions in which a fetus exists. And so if we think about this, blood will bypass the pulmonary circuit in the fetus. And we want to think about why it does this. Well, the obvious thing is that this fetus, sitting in the mother, is getting its oxygen from the placenta, not from anything it's breathing. But that's not necessarily the actual mechanism that's happening here. Because of this fetus doesn't have fully developed lungs, and they don't tend to develop until kind of in that third trimester. And maybe we're talking somewhere in the 7-month ballpark. So premature infants often come out with some respiratory difficulties because their lungs aren't really fully developed. The lungs, in fact, are collapsed while in the womb, and this puts pressure on the vessels that go to them. That actually means that it's harder to pump the blood to the lungs than it would be to pump it to the body. And all of this, of course, actually works in the favor of the fetus because it just needs to get enough blood to the lungs to help take care of the lungs it's not actually using them as a respiratory surface. Again, it's getting that oxygen from the placenta and delivering the carbon dioxide to the placenta. This all changes when that fetus comes out as a baby and takes its first breath. So that first breath will allow for the inflation of the lungs. That's going to therefore decrease the pressure because those vessels are no longer collapsed within those collapsed lungs. And that means that now blood can flow more easily to the right side than to the left side because we've changed that pressure relationship. The left side now has to pump to the entire body. The right side, that pulmonary circuit, only has to pump to the lungs. So what does this mean? Well, there are a couple of modifications we're going to take a look at in this chapter. So there is a hole in the fetal interatrial septum, and after birth it becomes something that is no longer a hole, but is still a recognizable feature. The hole uses the term foramen, and this is an oval hole, so it is the foramen ovale. I know we've seen a foramen ovale in the skull already, and it works kind of like this. The foramen ovale is here, and what's going to happen is because there's higher pressure for that left-hand side, it's going to be harder for blood to move through there. But the interatrial septum kind of works like a little flap valve here, and blood can push through the foramen ovale and slip over into that left atrium. So right atrium to left atrium. Once it's in the left atrium, of course, it can be pumped down to the left ventricle and pumped out through the aorta in that systemic circuit. Once birth occurs and that pressure is reduced on the left-hand side and relatively increased on the, or reduced on the right-hand side, relatively reduced or increased on the left-hand side, the pressure is going to push this section right here up against this, and that's going to cause those two to stick together, sealing off that intraatrial septum. But we can find in any adult heart a little depression here and a slight thinner wall of that intraatrial septum, which we call the fossa ovalis. Of course, we know that a fossa is an indentation, and this has the same shape there. Now, along those same lines, we have another way to get from the pulmonary circuit into the systemic circuit, and in this case, it actually would even allow the right ventricle to assist the left ventricle slightly in the pumping of the systemic circuit. There's an extra vessel here going between the top of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, referred to as the ductus arteriosus. So ductus because this is a duct, and arteriosus because it's an artery. There is, believe it or not, also a ductus venosus in the body, and this will be associated with blood coming in from the umbilical cord and working its way through the liver. But for right now, we're kind of focused on this ductus arteriosus. So when this right ventricle contracts, knowing that we're going to have some pressure out here in this pulmonary circuit, some of that blood will cross the ductus arteriosus, entering the systemic circuit, which is being pumped by that left ventricle. Now, after birth, this becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. We see that as this little white structure here that is basically tying that pulmonary trunk to the aorta. So ligamentum, because this has become a ligament. Arteriosum, it was formerly an artery. And what sometimes happens with vessels, not just here, but ones associated with the umbilical cord as well, is that once they are no longer used as vessels, they basically convert part of themselves into a fibrous connective tissue. In my view, this thing just kind of becomes a filled in but fairly rubbery kind of former vessel. So it doesn't necessarily always look exactly like this. It might even look a little bit vessel-like, but it'll be solid, it'll be very kind of rubbery in texture as a result of that, and certainly no longer serving as a vessel. So what do we talk about later on? Well, there's a little bit more in fetal circulation that is different, and we could address more of this. I'm going to go ahead and do a kind of a brief idea of this here. All of this has to do with the fact that the fetus is getting its nutrients and its oxygen from the placenta and not here from its lungs. So therefore, we have some kind of weird things going on. If we think about what's happening, we've got our two bypasses up here in the heart. We're going to have from our right atrium blood moving over into the left atrium through the foramen ovale. from our right ventricle, blood pumping out through the pulmonary trunk. Some of that will go out and feed the lungs, so they can, of course, develop. Some of it will slip across the ductus arteriosus into the systemic circuit, which pumps through the aorta. When we get down here to the bottom of the abdominal aorta and we split into our common iliac and then internal iliac, we're going to give rise to some umbilical arteries. And you can see that these are delivering blood, which is shown here in purple, indicating some kind of mixed oxygen concentration, and that's going to go out to the placenta. So at the placenta, it's going to pick up oxygen, it's going to return it through a single umbilical vein, and that umbilical vein is going to come up here through the liver. Now it ends up that normally we're going to have a lot of our venous blood come through something from our intestines called the hepatic portal system into the liver. We're going to have this actually split in two here, and there's going to be a portal sinus which will drain blood into the liver, which then can ultimately be drained out of the liver into the inferior vena cava. But we're also going to have the ductus venosus, which forms a bypass and goes directly to the inferior vena cava. That's the one that ultimately becomes the ligamentum venosum. But this bypass is because we don't need the liver of the infant to process this blood coming from the placenta. That's blood that already has nutrients that have been processed by its mother. So that blood can be delivered directly up here back to that right atrium, where again it's going to go to the left atrium or from the right ventricle into the aorta in those two bypasses we've already addressed.